let them melt in the air. Who could care? Who could care? And my cats, they mean everything to me. I understand them, I see their souls. But if I die today...
Hello and welcome to Marxism Today. This is Red Wagner. Today's episode is part 2 of Estranged Labor. Today we'll be getting into the second thing that workers are alienated from, which is the labor process. But first we'll finish up the first thing that they're alienated from. We still have a little bit more to go on that. So let's get into the reading. Let us now look more closely at the objectification, at the production of the worker, and in it at the estrangement, the loss of the object of his product. The worker can create nothing without nature, without the sensuous external world. It is the material on which his labor is realized, in which it is active, in which and by means of which it produces. But just as nature provides labor with the means of life, in the sense that labor cannot live without objects on which to operate, on the other hand, it also provides the means of life in a more restricted sense, i.e., the means for the physical subsistence of the worker himself. Thus, the more the worker by his labor appropriates the external world, sensuous nature, the more he deprives himself of the means of life in two respects. First, in that the sensuous external world more and more ceases to be an object belonging to his labor, to be his labor's means of life, and second, in that it more and more ceases to be a means of life in the immediate sense, means for the physical subsistence of the worker. In both respects, therefore, the worker becomes a servant of the object, first in that he receives an object of labor, i.e., in that he receives work, and secondly, that he receives means of subsistence. This enables him to exist first as a worker, and second, as a physical subject. The height of the servitude is that it is only as a worker that he can maintain himself as a physical subject, and that it is only as a physical subject that he is a worker. Okay, there's a lot in that section. First, Marx is talking a little bit here about the alienation to nature. He doesn't say it very clearly because that wasn't something that concerned people in 1850 or actually 1840s when he was writing this. But he's getting at that a little bit here, where he's talking about you need to have the real material world provided by nature in order to work on, and the thing you produce is part of nature, a changed part of nature, and you're alienated from those by a capitalist labor process. He also mentions here that when he says it's only as a worker that he can maintain himself as a physical subject, that's saying that only because he's a real person is he able to work in the world. But under capitalism, of course, he must be a worker if he's going to maintain himself as a real person in the world, because he needs to provide himself with the necessities of life by working, by selling his labor and then using that money to buy those things. According to the economic laws, the estrangement of the worker in his object is expressed thus. The more the worker produces, the less he has to consume. The more values he creates, the more valueless, the more unworthy he becomes. The better formed the product, the more deformed becomes the worker. The more civilized his object, the more barbarous becomes the worker. The more powerful the labor becomes, the more powerless becomes the worker. The more ingenious the labor, the less ingenious becomes the worker, and the more he becomes nature's slave. The one that I really want to highlight, this is very poetic writing that he's doing here, where he's saying over and over again the same thing, but with a different focus each time. The focus I want to draw your attention to is the bit where he says the more ingenious labor becomes, the less ingenious becomes the worker. Here, if you think about machine usage or technological innovation, we can really see what this is talking about. So with more machines, more advanced machines, the labor becomes more advanced, more ingenious. In other words, the machine is smarter and does more of the work, but the worker becomes less ingenious because the worker's activity might be reduced from doing something that involves a lot of decision making and a lot of creativity on his part to something like 3 simple repetitive motions at the same machine. Political economy conceals the estrangement inherent in the nature of labor by not considering the direct relationship between the worker, labor, and production. It is true that labor produces for the rich wonderful things, but for the worker it produces privation. It produces palaces, but for the worker hovels. It produces beauty, but for the worker deformity. It replaces labor by machines, but it throws one section of the workers back into barbarous types of labor, and it turns the other section into a machine. It produces intelligence, but for the worker, stupidity, cretinism. That's more about the machines there. I want to highlight the bit where he says, machines throw one section of the workers into barbarous types of labor. So one section of the workers is displaced, unemployed, and has to find probably some work that's worse. And the workers who are not displaced, who remain at the workplace and use those machines, are turned into a part of the machine. The simpler the work becomes, the more repetitive it becomes, the more like a machine the worker is. This direct relationship of labor to its products is the relationship of the worker to the objects of his production, the relationship of man to the means of the objects of production, and to the production itself is only a consequence of the first relationship, and confirms it. We shall consider this other aspect later, when we ask then, what is the essential relationship of labor? We are asking about the relationship of the worker to production. Okay, so there's a lot of different things to consider here, and he's bringing up some of them. First, we started out with the relationship of the worker to production, but even more specifically to the objects produced. Pretty soon we'll move on to a different relationship of the worker to production. Till now, we've been considering the estrangement, the alienation of the worker only in one of its aspects, i.e. the worker's relationship to the products of labor. But the estrangement is manifested not only in the result, but in the act of production within the producing activity itself. How could the worker come to face the product of his activity as a stranger, were it not that in the very act of production he was estranging himself from himself? The product is, after all, but the summary of the activity of production. If then the product of labor is alienation, production itself must be active alienation, the alienation of activity, the activity of alienation. In the estrangement of the object of labor is merely summarized the estrangement, the alienation in the activity of labor itself. What then constitutes the alienation of labor? First, the fact that the labor is external to the worker, i.e. it does not belong to his intrinsic nature, that in his work, therefore, he does not affirm himself but denies himself, does not feel content but unhappy, does not develop freely his physical and mental energy, but mortifies his body and ruins his mind. The worker therefore only feels himself outside his work, and in his work feels outside himself. He feels at home when he is not working. When he is working, he does not feel at home. His labor is therefore not voluntary but coerced. It is forced labor. It is therefore not the satisfaction of a need. It is merely a means to satisfy needs external to it. Its alien character emerges clearly in the fact that as soon as no physical or other compulsion exists, labor is shunned like the plague. External labor, labor in which man alienates himself, is a labor of self-sacrifice, of mortification. Lastly, the external character of labor of the worker appears in the fact that it is not his own, but someone else's, that it does not belong to him, that in it he belongs not to himself, but to another. Just as in religion, the spontaneous activity of the human imagination, of the human brain and the human heart, operates on the individual independently of him, that is, operates as an alien, divine, or diabolical activity. So is the worker's activity not his spontaneous activity. It belongs to another. It is the loss of his self. As a result, therefore, man, the worker, only feels himself freely active in his animal functions, eating, drinking, procreating, or at most in his dwelling, in his dressing up, etc. And in his human functions, he no longer feels himself to be anything but an animal. What is animal becomes human, and what is human becomes animal. Certainly, eating, drinking, procreating, etc. are also genuinely human functions, but taken abstractly, separated from the sphere of all other human activity, and turned into the sole ultimate ends, they are animal functions. What we have here is Marx making a distinction between animals and humans, and there's a lot of different ways to distinguish between animals and humans. What he says, the thing that separates humans from animals, is that human beings think about what they're going to do with their time, what they're going to do with their labor. They're creative, and they make choices and do that thing. And then they might think about it later, make changes, do it a different way the next time, or do something else the other time. They're not controlled by instincts, and they change how they do things. He also says that when someone else, like your boss, is telling you what to do, how to do it, when to do it, that takes away that humanity from you. It separates you from the labor process, and that labor process is what makes you human. In other words, controlling your own labor is what makes you human. And when your labor is controlled by someone else, Marx is saying someone is taking away your humanity. So in that way, capitalism robs us of our humanity. We have considered the act of estranging practical human activity, labor, in two of its aspects. One, the relationship of the worker to the product of labor as an alien object exercising power over him. This relation is at the same time the relation to the sensual external world, to the objects of nature as an alien world inimically opposed to him. 2. The relation of labor to the act of production within the labor process. This relation is the relation of the worker to his own activity as an alien activity not belonging to him. It is activity as suffering, strength as weakness, begetting as emasculating, the worker's own physical and mental energy, his personal life, for what is life but activity, as an activity which is turned against him, independent of him and not belonging to him. There we have self-estrangement, as previously we had the estrangement of the thing. And that's it for the second part of Estranged Labor. You can see here this mainly focuses on the second type of alienation, which is that alienation from the labor process. It's feeling like an animal, like you're turned into an animal because you can't control your own labor, which is what Marx claims makes us human. So next time we'll get to the third type of alienation, and we should be done with this after episode 4. There are 4 types of alienation, so 4 episodes will work really well. And I'll see you then. Thanks for tuning in.
Get me wrong, I'm in all of this world and its complexities. But meaning isn't based on the importance of being, but on the relationships in between. I said meaning isn't based on the importance of being, but on the relationships in between.
This episode is part of the Marxism Today podcast series. Marxism Today is recorded, mixed, edited, produced, and maintained by Red Wagner. It is distributed freely and licensed under the Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial Share-alike 3.0 license. To find out more about the Marxism Today podcast, visit our website at marxismtodaypodcast.wordpress.com, where you can find archives of all of our episodes available for download. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.